Good morning, welcome everyone. For anyone I have yet to meet, my name is Deirdre Schreiber, and I am the Associate Director of Learning and Development in Hewitt. Just a quick reminder of why we are gathering together to do additional tech talks throughout the year. The goal here is to really continue the spirit of the IT Summit throughout the year and create additional opportunities so we can all learn from each other, strengthen connections, and learn about more technology that is going on around Harvard. So I'm very excited today for our tech talk of public facing systems, the missing concept in prioritizing risk. We're joined today by Gil Nunes, Senior Information Security Architect from Harvard Medical School. So without further ado, Gil, take it away.
Thank you, Durga. Just starting with a little bit of introduction. My name is Gil Munoz. I have over 20 years. I think I know most of you all, and most of you all know me, but there's probably a few of you that I do not know. 20 years across all domains in IT, and 13 plus years with a primary focus on cybersecurity, and been with Harvard Medical School since May of 2024. And y'all can look at this stuff later on. The slide deck will be available. And what we're going to be looking at public facing systems and how that has been in cybersecurity. That has been a missing factor throughout the industry. So we'll start with looking at why public-facing systems, what they are, and a rationale for why they're important, and then we'll look at how they're missing in frameworks and regulations, and also in software and tools for cybersecurity. And we'll look at some attempted solutions, different solutions that I've come across that different people have proposed and different tools have tried to use. And then we'll look at HMS's solution, the solution that we've implemented, and we'll bring that around to the conclusions with some lessons learned and takeaway, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So starting with why public-facing systems. And this really started in 2018. Texas A&M University formed a brand new security team, and Michael Sardarizadeh, the CISO for Harvard Medical School, was named the CISO for Texas A&M, and he brought me into the security team. And one of my tasks was to help process firewall opening requests, and some questions started coming up. I was scanning the systems before they were open to the world, so we could resolve vulnerabilities before we opened them up. And so I asked, okay, what about the systems that have already been opened? How many do we have? Nobody knew an answer to that. What are they? Can we come up with a list of them? And no, the answer to that is no. We have no principled way of generating a list of our public-facing systems. How vulnerable are they? We don't even know what they are, much less how vulnerable they are. So, of course, those answers were completely unsatisfactory. So I set out to figure out, okay, how can we resolve that? And to start with, what I mean by public-facing systems is systems that are open at the external firewall of the organization, and they expose a service that's running on a system on our network to everybody out on the internet. There are openings for systems that are inside that open it to a specific outside system or a vendor that needs access to that system, and it's only open to them. But we're really concerned with the openings that basically take a system inside our network and make it available to everyone out on the internet. And why is that important? That means that those systems are accessible to every, not only to just internal threats. So um, it used to be that most compromises happen from internal threats. That has shifted over the years. Right now, it's about even,
Sorry,
but
I'm calling to refill a prescription for Forrest.
I'm sorry, you might need to mute on that. But um, but a lot has been said about internal systems are also extremely vulnerable. Um, but the problem with public-facing systems is that they're vulnerable to all of those that they're open to all of those internal threats, plus then also all of those threats from every opportunistic attacker out on the internet. So the way we resolved that at Texas A&M is I built a system, an integration that talked to our firewalls, our external firewalls, and figured out from the external firewalls, okay, what systems are open. And that's an important concept to look at. The source of truth for what is exposed to the world is the firewalls themselves. That's where that opening is created. That's where that opening is determined. So that is the source of truth for that. So I created a system that talked to the firewalls, got all of the firewall access rules, sorted through that to see, okay, what firewall access rules open something internal to every address out on the internet. And then took that list and sent it to the vulnerability scanners, ran a weekly scan of those systems, and then also talked to the IPAM, the IP address management system, to figure out, okay, who owns each of those systems, and then made that the results of the vulnerability scans on those public-facing systems made it available to our security team and to those system custodians. And so right away we found out, and by the way, all of this data that I'm sharing about Texas A&M has been shared publicly, and I have permission from Texas A&M to share it, to continue to share it. At the time when we started looking at that for Texas A&M, they had over 3,300 internal IP addresses that were IP addresses on their internal network that were open to the world. And so with that integration that I built, we were able to list them. And right away, we were able to see how vulnerable they are. And that is one number that they did not allow me to share. So that's redacted there. But over time, then over the next few years, we were able to go from that over 3,300 systems open to the world, down to the last number that I saw was actually a little under 800. So a huge reduction in threat surface. And not sharing the total number of vulnerabilities, but sharing just by percentage. From where we started, we were able to bring that way down, reduce those vulnerabilities. And one thing that happened at the very beginning, we just started with, okay, let's just tackle the top 10 most vulnerable systems. And very quickly that gave us results. We started going down, but that started slowing down. And so I realized we needed to change that. And so I built out my integration more where the system administrators could access it and they could see all of their systems that were vulnerable. And then that brought us, again, huge gains. And we got down to the last that I had seen, the last that I saw, we had 2 vulnerabilities that were accepted risk, that we had accepted as, the risk was not significant enough and the service needed to be available. So we were able to answer those 3 questions. How many systems we have? Now less than 800. Can we list them? Yes. How vulnerable are they? Accepted risk on 2 high-level vulnerabilities. Oh, sorry.
And Gil, a question did pop up in the chat. Were the
Yes.
public-facing systems only port 80 or 443, or did they include other ports? And
No, they
hopefully not
included-
22 standard.
They included any port, any opening that basically said so in viral access rules you have a zone, so the internal zone, which is your inside network, any address in there that's open on any port, any protocol, so basically any service open to the external zone, any address out there on the external zone, which is the internet. So yeah, no, not limited to specific ports. And that's important. And those scans also needed to scan not just port 80 and 443, but any port that's open to the world needs to be secure. So that really created a solution and cemented that idea of that this is something that needs to be addressed. And that also started me looking at, well, shouldn't existing security tools and standards and, cybersecurity is not a new thing. Why hasn't this been dealt with before? And so I started looking at different tools, cybersecurity tools, software like CrowdStrike, Axonius, and Tenable. They simply do not have a good solution for this. Axonius has finally, after I built my integration and was doing a lot of work, we started looking at buying Axonius for Texas A&M, and we bought it, but I started immediately talking to them. They had no solution at the time. I started talking to them, this was 6 years ago, about implementing what I had done, gave them my code, gave them documentation on how to do it. I think in the last year, they've started to put an exposures module, module out that deals with public-facing systems. But I haven't looked at it yet to see. What I've seen of it doesn't quite seem to get it. But a lot of tools just simply don't do anything. Like Tenable just has nothing, or CrowdStrike, they do scans from their external SAS throughout all IP address spaces and try and look for those systems. But none of those solutions really solve the question. And then you look at security standards and how they deal with prioritization of public-facing systems and why it is not sufficient. NIST 853, the way NIST 800-53 prioritizes systems is based on a category for that system, and it doesn't have a standard within. It doesn't have a way to build those categories. It relegates that to FIPS 199, and FIPS 199 basically categorizes the systems by impact only. So if the system was compromised, how much of a problem that would be for our organization? Is it a low-level problem, medium, high? And so we're going to look at what other standards do for HMS. Of course, Massachusetts regulation is very important, would be important, but there's not a lot there that requires or lays out how things should be done. I'm gonna forget what CMR stands for. Massachusetts regulation. I forget what the C. But this regulation in particular, that particular regulation basically says have a reasonable security program, and this would be what applies to private entities. Of course, we're governed by a number of different federal frameworks, federal regulations, and frameworks, and a number of those affect us. One thing that I wanted to mention, Massachusetts did set up for public agencies. It set up the Executive Office of Technology Services and Security. In 2017, it set that up and charged that agency with figuring out, okay, what controls should public agencies especially executive agencies, follow. That's not binding on HMS because we're not a public agency. But the reason I mention that is because I learned some lessons from when I was at Texas A&M, looking at the legislation there. And so the way legislation was before the early 2000s in Texas, it was policy and controls and implementation were all there in the legislation. They started adding requirements and things that public agencies should do in there. And of course, that becomes problematic because the minute a control needs to change or you need to update a control or a technology, now you have to take it before the legislative body to change the legislation. So in the early 2000s, what Texas did is they passed TAC 202, Texas Administrative Code 202, and that established the Department of Information Resources, which is very similar in function and structure and how that basically following policy governance, where you set up an agency that's going to handle those controls, that's going to establish those controls and make sure that they're enforced. But you don't say what those controls are. You leave it up to that agency to establish that list of controls. And the Texas DIR, what they did, they hired consultants to go through all those different controls, Gramm-Leach, Blaley, FERPA, HIPAA, all of those controls, and figure out, okay, how can we have a set of controls? What overlap is there? What are things that one set of controls has that the other ones don't? And they ended up publishing a crosswalk that basically cross-matches all of those different controls. And what they found out was that basically if you follow 800-53, you pretty much cover all of that stuff, all of those other frameworks. So NIST 800-53 really is the golden standard. And as I mentioned before, it bases its categorization on FIPS 199. But FIPS 199 categorizes systems by impact only. The problem with that is that the risk to a system is not just driven by impact. Impact is a very important part of it. If a system is critical to our function, any threat to it is that much bigger risk. The more critical that system is. But risk also takes into account the likelihood of that system being compromised. And the risk really is what are the chances of it being compromised, and then if it's compromised, so that likelihood, and then if it's compromised, how will that affect our organization? So that's the impact side. And so then the question is that likelihood of attack or compromise significantly greater for a system that is exposed to the world? And that should be an obvious answer.
I grab your call.
All right, I'm gonna put you on mute.
Yeah.
So if the likelihood of attack or compromise is significantly greater for a system that is public facing, that is open to the world, shouldn't this be a factor in how we prioritize risk? Well, it is. And actually, NIST does have a way that they factor in likelihood, but they do it later in the process. So they establish a risk management framework that has seven steps. And in Prepare, basically, you set up the structure. You set up the structure that says, okay, we're going to have a CISO, and CISO is responsible to establish a security program with controls, without at this point specifying those controls, and is supposed to enforce those controls across the information resources. So that's kind of preparing the stage. And then you can categorize your information resources. So at this point, you're needing to be able to have a good inventory of your information resources, users, data, systems. And then you set up, okay, what control should form the baseline for that? And that's where 800-53 comes in. That's that gold standard that says, okay, these are the controls that we should have on systems based on that category from FIPS 199, which takes into account impact. So we select the controls, we set up a baseline, and then we start implementing those controls and making sure that they're in place. And then when we come to the assess stage, that's where we assess risk. And so now we look at the likelihood of threats, and we say, okay, if a threat is more likely to impact a system, then that raises the risk for that system. And so that factoring in of likelihood only comes in at the assess step. And so then you move into authorizing and monitoring. But what I wanted to bring up here is if impact and likelihood are both factors of risk, they should be part of categorizing and selecting the control set. Case in point, the entire reason why we have a DMZ is because we recognize that systems that are exposed to the world should have a different set of controls. They shouldn't be treated as far as security controls in the same way that the rest of our systems on our internal network are treated. Or if another example would be vulnerability management. For example, at Harvard, we have the CIO Council standard, and we have 30 days to resolve a higher critical vulnerability from the time that it's found, but only 14 if it's a known exploited vulnerability, if it's being actively exploited. Well, but shouldn't we have a standard that's even tighter for systems that are open to the world? And in fact, that's part of what AgeVerse, so Harvard is putting in place AgeVerse, and one of the factors in AgeVerse is that exposure. And so that adds that factor in and says, okay, because of that exposure, we're going to treat those systems differently. The control now changes. At Texas A&M, we actually said if it's a public-facing system, you have max of 7 days, regardless of whether it's exploited or not, to get it remediated, and really should be done, as soon as possible. But the idea there is, when we look at vulnerability management for public-facing systems, that should be getting treated differently because that vulnerability is so much more likely to be exploited. So we should have controls that are tighter for those systems. So in fact, likelihood should affect how we categorize systems so that we can then select the controls that are appropriate for the category, that category being public-facing systems. But it's just not a concept that's there yet in the NIST standards and risk management framework. So some things that have been tried, as I've looked at different solutions and discussed this with different people, is to, for example, look at the IP address itself. So at Harvard Medical School, we use 134.174 addresses that are public. So those are internet routable. So we could say, okay, anything that is in that address space is public facing, and anything that's in private address spaces, so 10 addresses or 192.168 addresses, those are private, because we know those are not internet routable. They cannot be accessed from anywhere on the internet. The problem with that is that there's cases where that's not true, where something has a public IP address, a 134.174 in the case of HMS, but is not open to the world. For example, targeted firewall openings. We have a system in our network that needs to be open to the vendor that supports that system, but we only open it to that vendor. It's not open to the world. Or if you have a geographically distributed network, you might have some addresses that are public facing in each of your locations, but really they're only open to that other segment of your geographically distributed network. And there's just other reasons why you can have a system with a public IP address, but it's not really public facing. So that generates a lot of false positives. Another attempt that has been tried, and this is the way that CrowdStrike has tried to address it, is to do external scans. So if you scan the address space for an organization and see what responds, and you scan it from outside the firewalls, supposedly the things that respond are going to be the stuff that's actually open to the world. There's a number of problems with that. Number one, that's going to be a lot of scanning if you're going to hit all 65,000 ports to make sure that you catch every port that's open. Number two, firewalls, especially like our firewall, the Palo Alto, is very good at detecting that kind of scanning and putting a stop to it. And so if it says that it's getting hit by one IP address out there that is trying to hit 100 different systems, one after the other, port after port, it'll just basically block that IP address. And it's just a wasteful use of network bandwidth. Another problem with that is that internet service providers will share detected scanning activity. So that information could actually get out to other entities that, and it's sensitive information. So not really a good practice, not a good way of doing things. So the way that we've done it at HMS, we basically took the lessons that I had learned from my work at Texas A&M, and we asked the same question, right? How many systems? We don't know. What are they? Don't know. How vulnerable? So we built a system. I built an application that talks to the firewalls and get those firewall access rules. And then we put that into a vulnerability scan that runs every week, and does an external scan, a remote scan like an attacker would, and hits those systems, scanning them for vulnerabilities. And so then we were able to answer those questions. And we found that we had over 6,200 IP addresses in our network that were open to the world. And so then we were able to list them. We could tell what they were and what ports were open on them. So, and how vulnerable they were. We found, just with that remote uncredentialed scan, we found that there were 251 high and critical vulnerabilities that were easily discoverable. So any malicious attacker out in the internet, they have tools that are freely available that can do the exact same scan, sometimes even better. And so it would be not a big problem to find these vulnerabilities for an attacker out there. So that left us with, a lot of openings to get into our network. And so we started working with sysadmins to remediate all of that. And again, like at NM, we saw great success. By the way, we were able to bring those 251 down, and where we stand right now, where we stand right now, out of the 6,280, and I'm going to call out OE on this, at Texas A&M, it took us years to bring that down from 3,300 to under 800. At HMS, we identified we had 6,280. We talked with Uwe, who manages the firewalls, and he had inherited this thing here with 6,280 public-facing systems. Within a few weeks, within less than 4 weeks, I think it was maybe less than 3 weeks, he had brought that down from over 6,200 down to 673. Cut out a lot of those openings. So I was able to identify ones that were no longer necessary and just eliminated them. So 89.3% threat surface reduction is in a handful of weeks is beyond amazing. So awesome job by Uwe. And what are they? Yeah, we can list them. And how vulnerable are they? So right now we have 2 high-level vulnerabilities that we'll be working this week to get those. Those are fairly new. I think they just came up in the scan last week. So we'll be working on getting. We're working on with the system custodians to get those results. So I want to go back to this graph because I love this graph. And you see how when spikes happen, because we're looking at it and being able to identify those vulnerabilities, we're able to work with system custodians and bring those things right back down. Here we had a spate of a lot of stuff being discovered, and even if we brought it back down, it kept going back up, and finally we're able to get it back under control. A couple of weeks ago, we had another spike up, and we're able to bring it back down. But that's that visibility and that constant vigilance on public-facing systems. So, in conclusion, what worked well? Definitely the threat surface reduction that, coming down from 6,200, over 6,200 IP addresses open to the world down to just over 600. Huge threat surface reduction. The vulnerability reduction also, that worked extremely well. The pitfalls, so some of the things that we're still working on resolving. I would love to see software vendors implementing a solution for this in their tools. So things like CrowdStrike, and I still got to get Axonius to make sure that they're working with that list of publicly exposed systems and handling that properly and with good reporting. The other thing is, what about cloud assets, those that don't live in our network but are created, in the cloud and then open to the world? We need those. Or actually, I should have mentioned on here, what about things that are hosted externally? We pay a content service provider to host a website, so it's not in our network, not open through our external firewall, but it just lives out on the internet, open to the world. And we're working on those, and we do have a solution where we're talking to our IP address management system, Infoblox, to query all of the IP address, all of the name space for HMS. So every domain that HMS owns, and then every subdomain under it, and then we can query that and see, okay, what address is it in, and if it's a public address that's not in our network, in our address space, then it's probably, and it's public IP address, then it's almost definitely open to the world. So we have a way to deal with that, and we're working on working that out and making sure it works with the proper scanning and all of that. So takeaways, just the big thing is just that importance of prioritizing public-facing systems. And if you remember only one thing out of this whole presentation, it's that exposure changes likelihood. If a system is more exposed, if it's public-facing, it's more likely to be attacked and more likely to be compromised. And therefore, likelihood has to change how aggressively we defend that system, how aggressive we are at making sure that it's secure. So as a call to action, where do we go? For HMS leadership, this is just a big win for HMS security. As we work through the solution, great support from HMS leadership. And for HMS system administrators, basically just a well done. Again, I go back to that graph and how all I could do was point to the vulnerabilities. I couldn't really fix them. And it was really sysadmins that did the fixing, that reduced those vulnerabilities, that took care of the problem. So awesome job by our system administrator teams. And just for those not in HMS or even those in HMS also, just keeping that vigilance. If you manage systems or if you support systems, if you develop systems, do you know which of those ones that you are responsible for, do you know which ones face the internet? And do you know that they are secure, that they have tighter security controls because of that public exposure? So thank you very much. That was it for my presentation, and we'll open it up for questions now.
And folks, feel free to, again, either add your questions to the chat, or you can also do the virtual hand raise to ask your questions and come off mute.
Justin Martel has a question.
Hi, I was just curious to know if you guys tracked like bot crawling behavior against these IP addresses or like attempts at enumeration. And I was a little bit late, so maybe you covered that in the beginning, but I was curious to know if you've noticed like a linear decrease in that type of activity as well.
So that's not something that we would do through this public-facing systems effort. So I had not covered it, but we've done some of that. I believe the correct term for that is dark botting, and Amanpreet Parmar, who's one of our team members, has looked at different sources that share things that, different ways that bots can attack HMS resources and specific to HMS or to Harvard. And he's discovered some things, discovered a vulnerability in a long existing software at Harvard that was being used for that kind of thing. And that was an open redirect that allowed people to mess with, to basically send, cause users to go to a malicious resource, that a malicious site that was masquerading as HMS. And the user would think that they were going to HMS, but the HMS site had that vulnerability. Not just HMS, sites throughout Harvard had a vulnerability that would basically allow the attacker to cause the user to go to HMS but get bounced right back to the malicious site. So we've done some dark botting, but yeah, and I've written a policy document, not a policy document. I've written a process document for doing that on a regular basis, but it's not really. After I worked through that, I realized, wait a minute, that's not really our team's job. So I'm in risk management and security assessment. That's more of a threat. So that would belong more in the security operations. So,
got it. Thank you.
Yeah, we've done some, but yeah, it's still, it is something. It's something that should be done. So we need to work on that.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have a question in the chat. Are you talking to Hewitt about organizing a centralized scan, or to encourage and coordinate other schools to audit public-facing networks?
We've made everything that we've done available to Hewitt. We've made ourselves available to work with any other schools or any team to do that same kind of discovery, and to help groups discover, through firewalls. I believe Hewitt has done some work on doing that discovery through on their external firewalls, to make sure that they have a list of what's open to the world. So there has been some work on that, and we're available to do anything else that's needed by any school. Yeah. And HVerse is addressing that by basically prioritizing those vulnerabilities, giving them a higher risk score so that they are prioritized. I would suggest that they should be, anything that's public facing should get a kind of its own separate high priority treatment. So.
Any other questions that folks have? Right, if there are no additional questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Gil, for taking the time and sharing what you're working on. We greatly appreciate it. We will be posting and sharing the recording along with the presentation that Gil delivered today. But thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your engagement and participation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.